Welcome to Horrified Stories, where if fear comes to life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. The wind howled through the barren trees, the last remnants of autumn clinging to the branches like forgotten memories. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds swirling in the distance as though the world itself was holding its breath. In the town of Greystoke, a place long forgotten by time, the house on Old Mill Road stood as it always had, an imposing structure, its jagged silhouette cutting into the horizon like a wound in the earth. The locals called it the house that screamed, a name whispered behind closed doors, a name spoken only in the dead of night. Mara Miller didn't believe in ghosts, not anymore, not since she had spent years burying the memories of her past, locking away every trace of the horrors she had witnessed in her childhood. But when her estranged aunt, the last living relative she had, passed away unexpectedly, Mara found herself standing at the edge of the long, winding road that led to the old mansion. She had never visited it before. Her mother had spoken little of her sister, a woman with whom she had a strained relationship. From what Mara could gather, her aunt had been eccentric, prone to fits of madness, and had lived in that house alone for decades, ever since her husband disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The town gossiped, of course, about the strange happenings that surrounded the house, strange lights, shadows moving in the windows, and, most disturbingly, the sounds of someone or something screaming at night. But Mara, with her rational mind, dismissed it all as superstition. At least, that's what she tried to convince herself. The house loomed before her now, its once white walls faded and cracked, covered in ivy that seemed to reach out like fingers, clawing at the stone. The front door, hanging slightly ajar, creaked in the wind, a welcome mat long since rotted and torn. Despite the decay, the house had an undeniable presence, as though it was waiting for her, as though it had been expecting her. Mara stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Her heart raced, a mix of dread and curiosity gnawing at her insides. She wasn't sure why she had, common duty, obligation, or maybe the nagging feeling that something was calling her. "Get it over with," she whispered to herself, straightening her posture. "You have to do this." With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. It was heavier than she expected, groaning on its hinges as it swung inward. The smell of dust, mildew, and something far older something fouled at her immediately. She wrinkled her nose but stepped inside. The foyer was dark, the only light coming from the gray afternoon spilling through the grimy windows. A staircase loomed ahead, leading to the upper floors, while doors on either side led to other parts of the house. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns barely recognizable beneath the grime. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, its sound almost oppressive in the silence. "Hello," Mara called out, her voice small, as though it might disturb something in the house. But the house offered no answer, only the heavy silence of abandonment. She walked further into the room, her footsteps echoing unnervingly loud. It felt as though the house was alive, breathing in sync with her, waiting for her to make the first move. The tension in the air was thick, and with each step she took, the house seemed to grow heavier. She reached for the light switch beside her, but the bulb flickered dimly before dying altogether, plunging the room into near darkness. A chill ran down her spine. Mara's fingers brushed against the banister as she ascended the stairs. Though it was cold and worn, like the house itself had been left to rot for far too long, she reached the top and hesitated, looking down the long, narrow hallway. There were 3 doors, one at the end, one on the left, and one on the right. The right door was partially open, the faintest sliver of light coming from the crack. Mara felt drawn to it, a curiosity she couldn't shake. But as her hand reached for the door, the sound came a low, guttural groan from somewhere deep within the house. It was followed by a sharp, blood-curdling scream that rattled her to the core. Mara recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she stood frowning, listening. The scream echoed again, louder this time, more frantic. It sounded human, desperate, as if someone or something was begging for help. But when the scream stopped, everything fell eerily silent. The house seemed to swallow the noise, leaving only the faintest trace of a lingering presence. Mara's mind raced. She wanted to leave, to turn around and walk out the front door, but her feet felt like they were rooted to the spot. She had to know what was happening. What had happened in this house? With a trembling hand, she pushed open the door to the right. The room was small, with heavy curtains blocking out what little light remained. A large 4-poster bed Saturday in the center, its sheets disheveled, as though someone had been lying there recently. But it was the walls that caught her attention, covered in strange markings, etched into the wood like symbols, some faded, others still visible, drawn in dark, dried stains that resembled blood. A low sound, almost a whisper, floated through the air, the unmistakable sound of someone crying. Mara took a step forward, her breath shallow. "Hello," she called, her voice faltering. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a soft voicey whisper so faint it might have been a trick of the wind. "Get out!" The words were clear, a warning. Mara's skin prickled as she slowly backed away from the room. But before she could retreat, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking her inside. Her heart leapt in her chest. She scrambled for the door, her hands shaking as she tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped, the air turning frigid. She felt the unmistakable weight of something behind her, something heavy, oppressive, and cold. Then came the voice again, louder this time. "Leave now, or stay forever." Mara spun around, but there was no one there. The walls closed in, the floor beneath her feet trembling as if the house itself was alive, breathing with malicious intent. The house was calling to her, and it wasn't about to let her go. Mara stumbled back from the door, her pulse racing in her ears. Her hands gripped the knob with trembling fingers, desperately trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though the house itself was pressing against her, holding her captive. She could hear her heart pounding in her chest, each beat drowning out all other sounds. "Leave now, or stay forever." The voice, soft and hollow, reverberated through the room, as though it were coming from the walls themselves. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath misting in the air. A thin layer of frost began to form on the window panes, and the walls creaked, groaning under the weight of some unseen presence. Her mind was a whirlpool of panic. The house was alive. She had to get out. She knew that much. But where could she go? The only exit was the door that wouldn't open, and the thought of trying to escape through the window, if she could even manage to break it, seemed like a fool's idea. A sudden movement in the corner of the room caught her attention. It was fleeting, a mere shadow flitting in the dim light, but it was enough to make her freeze. Her breath caught in her throat as she instinctively stepped back toward the door, her fingers still pressed desperately against the knob. A faint whisper reached her ears, this time not from the walls, but from directly behind her. "You shouldn't have come." She spun around, but there was no one there. She was alone, or so it seemed. She stepped forward cautiously, the hairs on her neck standing up as if someone or something was watching her. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were inching inward. She could hear the sound of something scraping along the floor, faint but persistent. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the ceiling above her, followed by a piercing scream that rattled her bones. It was so close, so vivid, as if someone had been standing right there, screaming in agony. Mara's stomach lurched, her body locking in terror. From somewhere above, from deep within the bowels of the house, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, low and deliberate, echoing through the halls. They weren't her footsteps. She was certain of that. Someone or something was coming down the stairs. For a split second, Mara's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs betrayed her. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. She couldn't move. Her eyes flickered toward the door again, but it was still locked, still refusing to let her out. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then a Geth voice whispered, not from the walls this time, but right behind her, close enough that she could feel the air shift. "Stay, or die." Mara's heart lurched in her chest, and in that instant, the paralysis lifted. She turned on her heel, pushing her shoulder into the door with all her might. But it was too late. The sound of the footsteps grew louder. There was something in the hallway, something coming closer. With a surge of adrenaline, Mara threw herself toward the window. She grabbed a nearby chair and slammed it against the glass. It shattered on the first hit, the jagged shards falling to the floor in a cacophony of noise. The wind from outside rushed in, cold and biting, as if inviting her to escape. She didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled through the broken window, her arms scraping against the jagged edges. The air was sharp against her skin, and for a moment, she almost felt like she could breathe again. She pulled herself out, her feet landing on the ground below with a loud thud. Mara stood there for a moment, gasping, her chest heaving. She could still hear the scream echoing in her mind, the footsteps still resonating in her bones, but she didn't dare look back. She couldn't. As she took a step away from the house, a strange compulsion tugged at her heart. It was as if the house was calling her back, urging her to return. The door she had just broken through seemed to beckon her. She looked toward the house one last time. For a fleeting second, The shadow in the upper window seemed to move dark and threatening, like a figure watching her. But Mara didn't turn around. She couldn't. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her further and further from the house, down the path and toward the town. The wind howled louder now, whipping through the trees and carrying with it an ominous whisper. "Don't leave! Don't leave me!" The words were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. She could feel them pressing against her mind, clawing at her thoughts. The house wasn't done with her. It wasn't done at all. Mara didn't stop until she reached the town. The roads felt strangely empty, the streets eerily quiet, as though even the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. She made her way to the only place she knew, the diner on the corner, a place that had been a fixture of the town for as long as she could remember. But even as she walked inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the warm air of the diner hit her like a comforting embrace. She was safe. She had to be. But even as she ordered a cup of coffee and Saturday at the corner booth, her mind kept drifting back to the house on Old Mill Road. What was happening there? What had happened to her aunt? The waitress, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, came over to refill her cup. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to speak. When she did, her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You were at that house, weren't you?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "You heard it, didn't you?" Mara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Heard what?" The waitress leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "The screams, the thing in the walls, the house that calls for you. It never lets go. It never lets anyone leave." Mara stared at her, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What do you mean? What happened there?" The waitress sighed deeply, her gaze dropping to the table. "You should have never gone there. No one who has ever stayed in that house has left the same, and no one has ever left it completely." As Mara sat her day there, grappling with the weight of what she had just heard, a new realization began to form in the pit of her stomach. The house didn't just scream. It didn't just keep the souls of the past locked within its decaying walls. It wanted something. It wanted her. And it was calling her back. Mara couldn't shake the feeling that the house on Old Mill Road was always with her now. It clung to her thoughts like a persistent whisper, a presence she couldn't ignore, no matter where she went or how far she tried to run. The eerie echoes of the house followed her, whispering in the corners of her mind. The waitress at the diner hadn't said much more. She just stared at Mara for a long moment, her eyes filled with a sorrowful recognition, as if she had seen this before, countless times. Then she turned away without another word, leaving Mara to sit with the weight of her cryptic warning. That night, Mara tossed and turned in her motel room. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner was the only sound that broke the silence. She tried to focus on anything but the house, but the whispers wouldn't stop. The words echoed in her head, growing louder with each passing hour. "Don't leave. Come back. You belong here." It was as if something was pulling at the very fabric of her being, a force more powerful than her will, more insistent than her fear. The dreamless sleep she longed for eluded her. Instead, her mind was filled with images of the house, its crumbling facade, its darkened windows, and the oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. When dawn finally broke, its pale light offered no comfort. The world outside seemed just as quiet, as still, and as unsettling as the house she couldn't leave behind. Mara knew she couldn't run from this any longer. She had to know the truth. And so, after a long, restless breakfast, she returned to Greystoke. The drive back was silent, the wind picking up as it swept across the road, swirling dead leaves in its wake. The town looked even more forlorn in the harsh light of day, its buildings half faded, its streets deserted. As Mara neared Old Mill Road, a sense of dread settled over her, thick and heavy, like the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressing against her skin. She slowed the car as she approached the turnoff that led to the house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. There it was, house standing on the horizon like a dark sentinel, waiting. She parked her car at the foot of the driveway, her breath shallow in her chest. The house didn't look any less intimidating from this angle. In fact, it seemed to grow taller, more imposing, as though it could swallow her whole. The air felt charged with a strange energy, as if the house was alive and watching, waiting for her to make her move. She took a deep breath and forced herself out of the car. The wind howled through the trees, the branches swaying with unnatural intensity, but there was no sound from the house, no creaks, no groans, no whispers, only a stillness that was almost quiet. It made her skin crawl. She walked up the gravel driveway, each step feeling heavier than the last, her mind racing with questions. The door, still ajar, beckoned her forward. As she approached it, the air seemed to shift, growing colder, the temperature dropping several degrees as though the house was exhaling a cold breath. Mara hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The darkness inside greeted her like an old friend, familiar and unsettling. The foyer was just as she remembered, it dusty, decaying, and cold. The same musty odor filled her nostrils, but this time it was thicker, almost choking. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The house was silent, but the silence felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, its second toe hand moving slowly, as though it had all the time in the world. The shadows seemed to shift and grow as she walked further into the house. She headed toward the staircase, the one that had terrified her the day before. As her hand touched the banister, the air seemed to throng with an invisible energy, and she felt the presence again watching her, pulling at her. A sharp, screeching noise echoed from above, a sound so grating and raw it sent a jolt of fear through her spine. She winced but forced herself to continue, climbing the stairs one step at a time. At the top, she stood still for a moment, her breath fighting in front of her. The hallway stretched out before her like a long, dark tunnel. She could almost hear something moving in the darkness. Something was in the house, something that wasn't just a memory. She moved toward the room with the strange markings, the one she had seen the day before. As she approached the door, she felt a sharp sting on her skin, a sudden, cold draft sweeping over her. The door, still slightly ajar, seemed to beckon her, drawing her in. The room was just as it had been before bed, the markings on the walls, but this time, the air felt different. It felt heavier. As she stepped inside, her foot brushed against something on the floor, something hidden beneath the dust. She bent down to investigate, her fingers grazing the object. It was a small, cracked porcelain doll, its eyes blackened, its smile twisted into a grotesque expression. Mara recoiled, her stomach churning. She knew she had to leave, but something held her there. The house was calling to her. Then she noticed something strange in the far corner of the room, a small trapdoor, half hidden by the bed, its edges worn and faded from years of use. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Curiosity burned in her chest, and against every instinct screaming at her to turn and run, Mara moved toward it. She dropped to her knees, her fingers trembling as she reached for the latch.
With a sharp tug, the trapdoor opened, revealing a steep staircase leading down into pitch-black darkness. A musty, damp smell wafted up from below, but she couldn't turn away. Something, some force, some hunger drew her down the stairs. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness, her heart racing. She reached the bottom and found herself in a small, windowless room. The air was thick with moisture, and the walls were lined with old shelves filled with dusty jars, books, and strange, unidentifiable objects. But it wasn't the shelves that caught her attention, it was the floor. The floorboards in the center of the room had been disturbed, pushed aside, revealing a gaping hole in the earth below. Something was buried there, something that had been buried for a very long time. Mara knelt down, peering into the hole. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the skeletal remains of a body, its hands bound, its mouth frozen in a scream. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was it, the source of the house's power, the thing that had caused all the pain, the suffering, the endless screams. This wasn't just a house, it was a prison, and the thing that had been buried beneath it wasn't dead, not entirely. Mara staggered backward, her heart racing in her chest. She had to get out, she had to leave before it was too late. But as she turned toward the stairs, the door slammed shut above her, trapping her in the dark, suffocating room. The whisper returned, louder than before, filled with malice. "You can't leave now, not after you found me." Mara stood frozen in the small, suffocating room beneath the house, her breath shallow and ragged. The door had slammed shut with a deafening thud, trapping her inside. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on her from all sides, as if the house itself had become sentient, aware of her every move. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, drowning out the whispers, but they were still there, crawling beneath the surface of her thoughts. "You can't leave now, not after you found me." The voice was a low, guttural rasp that echoed through her skull, making her body tremble. She tried to move toward the stairs, her legs like lead, but something was stopping her. The very air in the room seemed to congeal, thick with malevolent energy. The darkness around her deepened, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pushing her toward the hole in the floor where the body lay. Mara's eyes darted to the skeletal remains, their gaping mouth frozen in a silent scream, and the feeling of suffocating dread intensified. She knew what it was. She had already felt it before, the presence that had drawn her back, the force that had pulled her to this cursed place. The body beneath the floorboards had once been alive. Someone, or something, had been trapped here, imprisoned by the house itself, bound and silenced by its ancient, unyielding grip. And now, that thing was speaking to her. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself become like that corpse, lost in the dark, its soul never to find rest. But before she could take another step, the voice spoke again, this time from within her own mind, a terrible whisper that drowned out her thoughts. You belong to me now, you cannot escape. The ground beneath her feet shook violently, sending her crashing to the floor. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted, elongating into grotesque, shifting shapes. Mara's stomach turned, and she instinctively pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the whispers, but they were inside her now, inside her very thoughts. The door above her rattled as if something was pushing against it. The sound of footsteps echoed from above, slow and deliberate, getting closer. Mara scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as panic set in. She had to get out. There was no time to waste. She couldn't let herself become trapped. The house wanted her. It wanted to consume her, to keep her locked in its endless torment. Her eyes locked onto the hole in the floor once more. The skeletal remains seemed to reach for her, their fingers curling as if they were trying to pull her in. But it was not the body that held her attention. It was what lay beneath it, something deeper, something far older and more sinister. The faint glow of something iridescent flickered at the bottom of the hole, a dim, eerie light that seemed to pulse with the beat of the house's heart. The closer she got, the clearer it became, a series of symbols etched into the stone beneath the floor. Ancient runes, their meaning lost to time but their power undeniable. They glowed with a strange, supernatural energy, the same energy that had bound the house to its curse. The voice grew louder, rising above the growing chaos. It is too late, Mara. You have already given yourself to me. You have opened the door. Now you will stay. The walls groaned, their creaking sounding like the house was screaming in agony, the foundation itself shuddering as if struggling to hold itself together. And then, the house did something unexpected. It let her go. For one fleeting moment, the pressure in the air lifted, the walls stopped pressing in, and the oppressive silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of the door above her opening. She didn't question it. She didn't hesitate. She ran. With every ounce of strength she had, Mara surged toward the stairs, climbing them in a frantic, desperate scramble. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She had to escape. The door at the top of the stairs was wide open, and as she burst through it, she found herself back in the hallway. But it wasn't the same hallway. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. The house felt more ancient, more alive than ever before, as though it had been waiting for this moment. She turned to run, but something stopped her. A figure stood in the doorway at the end of the hall, a figure draped in shadows, its form obscured by the darkness. You cannot run, Mara. The voice was more powerful now, and with it came a surge of cold that filled the room, causing the very air to freeze. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, revealing its true form. It wasn't human. It was something far darker. Its body was twisted, its face a hollow mask of agony, its eyes wide and unblinking, as if it had been trapped here for centuries. A soul bound to the house. I was once like you, it whispered, its voice hollow and full of torment. I thought I could leave, I thought I could escape, but the house calls. The house always calls.
Mara's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the figure now. It was her aunt, the woman who had lived in this house before her, the one whose disappearance had brought her here in the first place. But it wasn't the woman she had known. This was something else, something dark, something broken. And it was trapped. The figure moved closer, its hands reaching for her, its touch cold and unyielding. Mara recoiled, but the figure's grip tightened, and she felt the familiar chill seep into her bones. She could feel the weight of the curse, the endless hunger of the house that had devoured so many before her. She screamed, trying to break free, but it was no use. She could feel the house pulling her in, dragging her toward the darkness. But then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something, the glimmer of light, the faintest shimmer of hope. The runes, the symbols beneath the floorboards, they were glowing again, brighter this time, their energy surging as if the house itself had recognized the threat to its existence. In a last-ditch effort, Mara wrenched herself from the figure's grip and ran toward the source of the light, toward the hole in the floor where the ancient tower lay. The house howled in fury as she crossed the threshold, but it was too late. The runes flared with blinding light, the energy building to a deafening crescendo. Mara closed her eyes, her breath steadying, and then a thing. When Mara opened her eyes again, she was lying in the same room, but it was empty now, the walls silent and still. The door above her was gone. The house was silent. The oppressive weight had lifted. She was free. But as she stood, looking around the now barren space, a strange thought crossed her mind. Was it really over? Had she truly escaped? And then she heard it, a faint, distant whisper coming from somewhere deep within the walls of the house. "You can never leave." And in that moment, Mara understood. The house would always call, and it would never let her go.